big economic question that is facing experts today in the United States is whether or not we are in recession. Now, traditionally, there are a number of key metrics that are used to evaluate whether or not we're in recession, GDP being a really big one, a really important one. And what's a little bit tricky about GDP is that it is a measure of the total economic activity across all asset classes within our economy. The reason why that is a challenge is that there are broadly two major asset classes, financial assets and real assets. Financial assets are non-physical assets whose value is derived from a contractual claim. So they can be things like bank deposits or bonds or stocks. On the other hand, we have real assets. And these are tangible assets. And so they're investments in physical things like real estate, energy, infrastructure. These are assets that you can actually touch and have an inherent physical worth. What makes things a bit tricky to evaluate is that right now, our economy is predominantly made up of financial assets. If we look at a chart of real assets relative to financial assets across the economy, we're at an all-time low in terms of the value of real assets relative to financial assets. I would say that actually kind of puts our economy on a dead-end road. In other words, most capital right now is being deployed to chase returns via financial assets rather than being invested in the creation of real assets. And it's manifesting itself in a lot of different ways right now. One particularly poignant way that is being manifested is in the massive housing shortage that we're seeing across all major metro areas in the United States. But there are other ways that this is being felt as well. A big part of where this is felt is the financialization of the economy and the constant asset price bubbles that we are seeing. Over the last 20 years, we've seen three major asset price bubbles and three major massive crashes. One was the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. Then about 10 years later was the housing bubble. And then we're seeing another one today, which has been essentially a 10-year bull run, followed by a massive bubble that popped at the end of 2021. And this was a bubble that was anticipated to pop at some point in 2020. So whether or not COVID facilitated this or not, it was expected to happen anyway around that same time. So financialization is a process whereby financial markets, financial institutions, and financial elites gain greater influence over economic policy and economic outcomes. The end result is an economy that cannot grow at all without near zero interest rates and without central banks effectively de-risking high-risk financial assets. The challenge that we face today is that due to financialization and capital that prioritizes investment in financial instead of real assets, government and central banks have fewer and fewer tools to effectively respond to economic shocks. To combat high inflation, for example, they're forced to destroy wealth and they're forced to prioritize the reduction of overall employment. And who faces that consequence is primarily retail investors and households, particularly those who have high exposure to financial assets as the primary source of wealth. So going back to this question of whether or not we're in recession, it's rather hard to tell. The traditional methods such as GDP don't really give us a clear picture because it doesn't really separate financial versus real assets. And in fact, given the geopolitical picture today, one where we are responding to geopolitical shocks with regards to energy prices, we're responding to the threat of supply chain shortages, our federal government is making a very, very clear shift towards the prioritization of allocating capital towards real assets and the creation of real assets, bringing manufacturing onshore, investing in renewable energy, as well as doubling down on energy security. So with all of these investments, which are going to hit the economy over the next 10 years, not all at once, but certainly it points to a movement of capital from financial assets to real assets, looking at GDP and looking at productivity and looking at and being confused by the strength in employment in spite of the Fed's attempt to increase interest rates. It means that we're not really looking at the bigger picture of where our economy needs to move towards in order to be in a sustainable position. So whether or not we're in recession and using those traditional financial metrics like GDP to measure that misses the big picture entirely. What we need to be looking at really is to what extent is the economy financialized, and are we on a path or a trajectory of moving more towards real assets? if we are doing that, then there should not be actual problems with employment staying as tight as it is. And in fact, given the continued decline of labor participation rate, tight employment does not actually mean that unemployment is actually persistent. Because if more and more people are leaving the economy and the unemployment rate stays the same, it actually means that the real unemployment rate is rising. So we are still moving towards the goal. But what it really suggests is that the Fed is a bit out of touch with the direction that the economy likely needs to move from an asset allocation perspective in order to hit the targets of addressing inflation in the first place.